like Heather said, we have an organic hop variety trial at our research farm in Albert, Vermont, where we're trialing 19 different varieties. It's about 3/4 of an acre. There we go. So hops were grown in this region in the mid-1800s. In 1845, Vermont was the largest producer of hops, but then by around 1910, they kind of waned out of production due to Vermont had prohibition that started a little earlier than the American prohibition, and downy mildew, which is a disease that can pretty much wipe out a hop yard pretty easily. In 2007, there was a hop shortage because of poor yields in the U.S. and in Europe, as well as a warehouse fire that took out about 4% of the crop. So in 2007, prices skyrocketed. So hops went from about $1 to $2 a pound to about $30, sometimes more. So in 2007, everybody kind of freaked out. All of these brewers are like, oh, I can't make beer. And so they started to look at more local production where they could have a relationship with the farmer so that they would ensure a crop. There we go. So this is a model of our hop yard. The red square outlines our variety trial, and then there's a cover cropping trial where we're looking at various things like beneficial effects, biological fertility, and things like that. The plots are 10 feet by 35 feet, and there's 5 hills in each plot, and each hill has a 70 square foot spacing, which is a little bit larger than they do in the Pacific Northwest, where most of the hops are grown. And that's because we wanted to increase airflow because of downy mildew. It would help limit the moisture in the hop yard. Hops are normally grown from rhizomes, and you can see that at the top. And propagation that way, but we did vegetative cuttings to try and limit the amount of seeds that we brought into our yard. Our yard was actually planted in August. Normally you plant in the spring, but it was planted in August of 2010 because it took some of the varieties a long time to propagate, and that's when we got them. And so they went to the ground and then were killed by frost a month and a half later. And due to that, there was some reduced vigor of a lot of the plants, plus the really wet spring, really wet fall in 2010. So there was a lot of root rot. So varieties that weren't particularly vigorous in the first place, like Tetnay, for example, got root rot. And then downy mildew also hit our yard in mid-June, and it affected some varieties worse than others. So plus they're very susceptible to downy mildew, and it was the result that a couple of hills died outright. But overall, we had pretty good survival. Potato leafhoppers and 2-spotted spider mites were the 2 worst pests in our hop yard. We scouted every week. There's a poster downstairs that shows our potato leafhopper data, and we can talk about that later. Oops, sorry. It's on the wrong direction. There it is. So this is our hop yard. It's about 16 feet tall. So the varieties are spaced in between each pole. One of the things that we're looking at is providing nutrient requirements for hops grown in the Northeast. This is applicable both organically and not organically, but for an organic hop yard, one of the biggest challenges is going to be getting enough nutrients there. Hops are really heavy feeders. So what we did is when we harvested it, we chopped up the vines and we sent off cones for nutrient analysis. And we found that about 3% of the dry matter was nitrogen, 2% was potassium, and about 0.5% was phosphorus. Other important nutrients are boron and zinc. So a mature hop yard will produce about 5,000 pounds of dry matter per acre. At 3% nitrogen, that's about 150 pounds of N that you need to supply every year to maintain your yields. The cones are 1/3 to 1/2 of that dry matter. So if you're going to take your cones off the field and you're going to sell them, but you could chop up the vine and return it to the field to meet some of those nutrient requirements. You run into issues possibly about disease propagation if you have downy mildew in your yard, putting the vines back in the field, or putting downy mildew back in the field. But it is an option. Hops take about 3 years to reach full maturity. So the first year's production is about a quarter to half of a mature yard. And so we found with our first, this is our first harvest was this year, and so we found it was about 1,750 pounds of dry matter. So you would want to fertilize 55 pounds of N, 35 pounds of K, and 9 pounds of phosphorus per acre. This is us harvesting. We harvested the entire yard by hand, which takes a really long time, and is the only way to really harvest a small-scale hop yard right now. Hops in the Pacific Northwest are grown on 500, 1,000 acres, so they have very large machines that cost several $1 million. It's not really what we're going to have here. We varied our harvest. It was about over 4 or 5 weeks. It was thrown off a little bit by Hurricane Irene. Tropical storm Irene, sorry. But our dry matters, we were targeting between 20 and 25%. So some of the varieties, cluster we harvested a little bit early. We're too excited. But there you go. Some varieties were harvested over a range of days, just to logistics of harvesting that many plants. Our first year yields, for some varieties were very respectable, and for some varieties were really low, Liberty for example. Cluster, so the variety that I told you was very susceptible to downy mildew, still yielded extraordinarily well, but that's just the first year yield. We don't know what's going to happen with downy mildew in cluster next year. Maybe all of the hills are going to die over winter, so we're not counseling people to plant an entire yard of cluster right now. But cluster and Galena both yielded very well. Galena, for example, is a high alpha hop, which means it has a lot of bittering properties, which is not necessarily something that local brewers are very interested in. Just because a variety yields well doesn't mean that the demand is going to be there. So these are things that we're talking to our growers and factors that they have to weigh. So the important brewing characteristics of hops are generally their alpha acids and their beta acids. The beta acids include a lot of essential oils, which give you oil, give you aroma. So like if you smell a nice IPA, it's going to smell a little citrusy maybe, or piney. And that comes from beta acids. This is alpha acids, which has to do with the bitterness of the beer. So the black bars show what the industry averages are, and the blue bars are what our hop yard yielded. So you'll see they're very different from the industry standard. That doesn't mean that they're less good, or it doesn't mean that they're better. It just means that they're different. Hops are like grapes. So like a Bordeaux wine can only come from the Bordeaux region of France. Hops, same exact hop grown here is going to yield something different from out west. So this gives us an angle in marketing to local brewers, being like, hey, listen, this is a Vermont hop. You can only get it here. Or this is a New York hop. You can only get it here. No one else in the country has this. You can create a specialty brew with that. So our alpha and our beta acids show the same thing, slightly different than industry averages, producing something pretty unique. So right now we're working on developing the infrastructure for small-scale hops growing. So I work for Extension. Extension is a large part of our mandate. We're designing a small-scale baler with the University of Vermont engineering students. This is their finished product. We have another one that's also in the works. It'll make a smaller bale. This makes 15 to 20 pound bales, they promise me. And it works really fantastic. It's a modified log splitter. That log splitter remains fully functional so that you can still use it to split the logs. And we're also designing a small-scale harvester with Chris Callahan of Callahan Engineering. And this will hopefully mean that we don't have to harvest 600 plants by hand next year. We're continuing our research. So we're looking forward to next year's harvest in year 2 in our hop yard. We're also continuing our cover cropping research, looking at beneficial insects, pest interactions, and things like that. These are some of the predatory insects we found in our hop yard, which are so cool. They're really beautiful. I don't know much about bugs until we started this. So this has been really interesting. We're really looking forward to seeing what we find. And so we have a website where all of our research is posted, and we have a website devoted specifically to hops. We have a hops blog on Facebook. We have lots of YouTube videos about how to build a hop yard, how to set up your irrigation system in your hop yard, and things like that.